Welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah.
If you're listening to this today,
Monday, March 9th.
right, Monday, March 9, 2026, you are probably, you're likely staring at a screen, completely overwhelmed.
Yeah, it's a flood.
An absolute flood of breaking news pouring out of the Middle East. Specifically regarding Iran, it feels like a fire hose of history right now.
It really does. Every single time you refresh your feed, there's another massive headline.
Another wave of military strikes, another conflicting report on Telegram or X about who is actually in charge in Tehran.
Rumors of troop movements.
Exactly. And videos of protests that you can barely even verify.
The sheer velocity of the information environment right now is just staggering. I mean, we are witnessing events moving at a pace that breaks traditional news cycles.
Yeah.
Attempting to process this magnitude of geopolitical upheaval in real time, relying only on those fragmented minute-by-minute updates, it's incredibly disorienting.
You end up with a severe case of historical whiplash, which is exactly why we are stepping back today. We need to establish the context of where we actually are, based on the enormous stack of intelligence briefings, academic analyses, historical models, and translated news reports that we've been compiling over the last few weeks.
Right, we have to trace the immediate roots of this crisis.
Because it didn't begin with the shock and awe we saw last week. It traces back to late December 2025.
When those massive nationwide protests erupted across Iran.
Right, and the initial trigger was a completely crashing currency, a devastating macroeconomic situation.
But over the last 2 months, that internal pressure cooker escalated into something entirely unprecedented in the history of the Islamic Republic.
Which brings us to February 28, 2026. The United States launched what they categorized as Operation Epic Fury.
Coordinated heavily with Israel's Operation Roaring Lion.
Right. These were massive, decapitating airstrikes, and the results detailed in our briefings have been just earth-shattering.
The death of Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei,
alongside the elimination of top military leadership across the country's armed forces.
So we are looking at a state facing a convergence of ultimate stressors. You have simultaneous, severe internal insurrection on one side.
An overwhelming, direct, external kinetic force on the other.
Yeah, it is a true geopolitical earthquake.
And that brings us to the mission of our deep dive today. We are going to cut through the noise for you. We're going to take your stack of sources and try to answer the ultimate question looming over all of this.
Could foreign intervention actually cause regime change in Iran?
Exactly. And to figure that out, we're going to analyze the current intelligence through the lens of 4 distinct historical events.
We'll look at the fall of Romania in 1989.
The Tunisian Revolution that sparked the Arab Spring in 2011.
The slow, grinding collapse of the Soviet Union from 1990 to 1991.
And crucially, Iran's own revolution in 1979.
Approaching it this way allows us to map current variables onto past outcomes. Because, while history doesn't repeat itself perfectly,
It rhymes.
it rhymes. The underlying mechanics of state failure, structural rigidity, military defection patterns, and what happens the day after a regime collapses, they often follow similar patterns.
So by comparing Iran's current architecture to these 4 distinct historical cases, we can separate the wishful thinking from the cold, structural realities of state power.
Exactly.
Now, before we jump into that timeline, I need to make a very clear, neutral statement directly to you, our listener.
This is really important.
It is. The sources we are utilizing for this deep dive contain highly politically charged rhetoric from all sides of this conflict.
This stack includes official press statements from the U.S. executive branch,
Translated broadcasts from Iranian state media,
and strategic transitional plans published by exiled opposition groups.
Right. So our goal here is to impartially unpack the content of these sources. We are not taking any sides.
None at all.
We are not endorsing any of the political viewpoints or policy decisions presented in these materials. We are simply here to analyze the facts, the data points, and the historical comparisons exactly as they have been presented to us in the source documents.
That is a vital foundation for this discussion. Analyzing the mechanics of state stability requires looking at deeply partisan and often emotionally charged sources with a completely detached analytical eye.
Okay, so let's unpack this. The origins of the 2025-2026 crisis. According to the intelligence summaries, this did not start with bunker-busting munitions.
No, it started in the Tehran Grand Bazaar on December 28, 2025.
The documents use the term macroeconomic exhaustion to describe the climate. Let's put some specific numbers to that phrase because they are staggering.
The currency devaluation.
Right. The Iranian rial crashed from 1.07 million to the U.S. dollar in November 2025.
Plummeting to 1.53 million to the dollar by March 2026.
You had bazaar merchants, who historically have been a foundational pillar of support for the Islamic Republic since 1979.
Essentially breaking away from the government.
They initiated strikes to protest massive price surges, aggressive tax increases proposed in the new budget, and just a totally unsustainable cost of living crisis.
The role of the bazaars cannot be overstated here. When the traditional merchant class goes on strike in Iran, it signals a systemic failure of the state's economic social contract.
Yeah.
But what the sources highlight is the rapid mutation of those grievances. It began with shopkeepers in Tehran angry about currency devaluation, but within 48 hours, by December 30th and 31st, the unrest had geographically detonated.
It spread to major universities and across over 210 cities,
touching all 31 provinces.
And the demands shifted dramatically. It ceased being a labor or economic dispute almost instantly.
The sources track a major ideological shift in the chants compared to previous protest waves, even the massive 2022 protests.
The demographic data in the reports notes young men playing a significantly larger, more physically confrontational role on the streets.
And the chants became explicitly violently anti-regime, and notably pro-monarchy.
Right. Protesters were recorded shouting, "Pahlavi will return," "Death to the dictator," and "Death to Mojtaba,"
specifically targeting Khamenei's son,
who was widely viewed as his potential successor. And they were waving the pre-1979 revolution lion and sun flag.
This demographic and ideological shift indicates that the economic trigger simply ignited a much deeper, pre-existing structural legitimacy crisis.
The society had reached a non-linear breaking point,
where reform was no longer the demand, total systemic overthrow was. However, as immense as this internal pressure was, the regime was deploying its standard, heavily rehearsed playbook.
Brutal kinetic suppression and digital blackouts.
The protests were a massive stress test, but the state apparatus was, up until late February, largely holding the line.
Which brings us to February 28, 2026, the introduction of the foreign intervention variable.
The U.S. initiates Operation Epic Fury, and Israel executes Operation Roaring Lion.
The White House and Pentagon briefings describe this operation in incredibly stark maximalist terms. President Trump framed the military action under a peace through strength doctrine.
And the stated explicit goal in these documents is not just deterrence.
No.
It is crushing the Iranian regime's operational capacity and permanently ending its nuclear threat.
We are talking about the coordinated obliteration of over 2,000 high-value targets across the Iranian landmass.
They systematically hit command and control centers, deeply buried air defense systems,
ballistic missile production facilities,
and key naval assets in the Persian Gulf.
The scale of the tactical degradation was immediate and historically unprecedented for the region.
The airstrike successfully decapitated the apex of the military and political leadership.
Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was killed in the initial waves.
But the targeting went far beyond the clerical leadership. Major General Abdul Rahim Mousavi was killed.
The commander-in-chief of the regular armed forces, the Artesh.
Right. And simultaneously, Major General Mohammad Pakpour, the commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps ground forces, was eliminated.
The U.S. government sources assessed that they have established localized air superiority and are actively dismantling what they term the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism.
But looking at the historical models provided in our stack, does physically decapitating the leadership of a hostile state automatically translate to the collapse of that regime?
That is the core analytical pivot of this entire situation.
It introduces the concept of the kinetic catalyst.
Let's define that for the listener.
So the internal protests were slowly, agonizingly eroding the regime's foundation over months. The airstrikes, however, fundamentally altered the balance of physical power overnight.
That's the kinetic catalyst.
Exactly. But dropping advanced munitions on leadership complexes does not magically erase a heavily entrenched, multi-layered state security apparatus.
To understand if this catalyst will actually shatter the Islamic Republic or merely severely wound it, we have to examine how similarly structured states have reacted when subjected to massive existential stress.
Right.
This idea of a state suddenly fracturing under pressure brings us to our first historical lens from the academic sources, Romania in 1989.
The sudden violent collapse of the communist dictator Nicolae Ceausescu.
The texts draw a very specific contrasting parallel here. The Romanian Revolution started in mid-December with a highly localized, seemingly minor protest in the city of Timișoara, over the government eviction of an ethnic Hungarian pastor.
Ceausescu reacted with overwhelming force. He ordered the military and his notorious secret police, the Securitate, to crush the dissent.
They opened fire on the crowds. But within a matter of days, the entire power dynamic flipped.
To understand that flip, we have to look at the architecture of Ceausescu's power. Political scientists categorize his regime as a sultanistic dictatorship. He ruled through a highly centralized system of extreme personal patronage, nepotism, and pervasive terror. He had systematically eradicated any semblance of civil society.
There were no independent labor unions, no student organizations.
And crucially, no reformist or moderate wing within the ruling Communist Party itself. The entire state apparatus was hollowed out and repurposed solely to serve the personal survival of Ceausescu and his family.
And because power was so hyper-concentrated in one man, it proved incredibly brittle when the population finally refused to back down.
When the protests rapidly spread from Timisoara to the capital, Bucharest, the regular Romanian army made a collective, spontaneous decision.
They almost unanimously defected.
They refused to continue firing on unarmed civilians, turned their armor and weapons around, and actively joined the protesters in the streets.
Ceausescu was forced to flee by helicopter from the roof of the Central Committee building on December 22nd, and he was executed by a firing squad on Christmas Day. The entire collapse took merely days.
The speed of that collapse hinged on two crucial variables that the comparative analysis highlights, and we must contrast these heavily with the reality of Iran in 2026.
Okay, let's look at the first variable.
First, the Romanian military defection did not happen in a geopolitical vacuum. It was precipitated by a massive structural green light from Moscow.
Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev had essentially signaled to the Eastern Bloc that the USSR would no longer deploy the Red Army to save hardline communist dictators who resisted his reform policies.
That external geopolitical signal gave the regular Romanian army, and even pragmatic elements within the Securitate, the psychological cover, and the strategic incentive to abandon Ceausescu.
They knew the Soviets weren't coming to bail him out.
Exactly. So let's map that onto Iran's internal security architecture today.
The sources emphasize that Iran does not rely on a single, conscript-heavy national army like Romania did. The Islamic Republic utilizes a heavily bifurcated military structure.
You have the regular national army, known as the Artesh.
And then you have the parallel institution, the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps.
And the documents are incredibly explicit that the IRGC is a completely different organizational beast than the Romanian Securitate.
The IRGC was intentionally designed by the architects of the 1979 revolution for one specific purpose: to prevent a military coup by the regular army.
They are deeply, relentlessly vetted for ideological purity. We are talking about an organization with roughly 150,000 active personnel.
And command over the Basij paramilitary force, which can mobilize up to 600,000 reserves.
But their power isn't just martial. They control vast, multi-billion-dollar sectors of the Iranian domestic economy.
They own telecommunications networks, massive construction conglomerates, and significant portions of the oil and gas smuggling infrastructure.
They are a military force, yes, but they are equally an entrenched economic cartel and a political empire.
While the regular army, the Artesh, has historically been intentionally underfunded, kept under tight surveillance, and physically distanced from the political core in Tehran, precisely so they could not threaten the clerics.
And what about that green light for defection that broke the Romanian military's loyalty?
The sources point out that there is absolutely no external green light being offered to the IRGC.
In fact, it is the exact inverse. The U.S. strikes are actively and aggressively targeting IRGC assets and leadership.
Furthermore, the internal doctrine of the IRGC relies on a distributed command model.
This means that even if the central command node in Tehran is completely cut off, or, as we've seen with Epic Fury, leadership is physically eliminated.
Lower-level provincial commanders are pre-authorized and trained to make independent tactical decisions to maintain territorial control.
They function like a decentralized network.
This leads to a critical extrapolation regarding the current battlefield. The briefings confirm that General Musavi, the commander of the Artesh, was killed in the strikes.
The analysis suggests this sudden decapitation leaves the regular Iranian army in a state of severe operational disarray.
Therefore, the classic Romanian defection scenario, where the regular conscript army steps in as the savior of the people and overthrows the dictator, appears highly improbable in the current Iranian context.
The Artesh is currently incapacitated and leaderless. while the IRGC, utilizing its decentralized command structure and fighting for its very economic and ideological survival, remains tightly gripping the levers of internal control.
It's a sobering realization. Knocking off the apex leadership doesn't neutralize the threat if the nervous system of the security state is explicitly designed to function independently of the brain.
Exactly.
But the military is only one half of the equation. What about the psychological momentum of the people on the street? How does information, or the lack of it, drive a revolution?
That brings us to our second historical comparison, Tunisia in 2011, the catalyst for the Arab Spring.
The Tunisian Revolution is frequently cited in academic literature as the modern gold standard for a grassroots, domestic uprising successfully and rapidly ousting an entrenched autocrat.
We all remember how it began, the tragic self-immolation of Mohamed Bouazizi, a young street vendor in the provincial town of Sidi Bouzid in late 2010.
That desperate act sparked a wave of massive protests driven by fury over chronic unemployment, police humiliation, and systemic corruption.
Within an incredibly short time frame, by January 14, 2011, President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali, a man who had maintained an iron grip on the country for 23 years, was forced to flee into exile.
And for years following that event, the dominant historical narrative was that Ben Ali's regime crumbled, primarily because the Tunisian military, specifically under the command of General Rachid Emmar, heroically refused direct presidential orders to deploy lethal force against the civilian demonstrators.
But the research in our stack reveals something absolutely mind-blowing about that narrative.
Yeah.
That famous story, the principal Tunisian general refusing to shoot his own people, was largely a functional myth.
It was a highly sophisticated piece of disinformation generated and amplified by domestic cyber activists.
The mechanics of why that specific piece of disinformation succeeded so spectacularly are crucial to understand.
It worked because it was deeply plausible within the Tunisian context.
The Tunisian regular military, very much like Iran's Artesh, had been historically marginalized, under-equipped, and distrusted by the Ben Ali regime, which heavily favored its sprawling internal police and security apparatus.
So when tech-savvy activists spread the rumor across Facebook and Twitter that the army was defying orders and forming a protective perimeter around the protesters, the public eagerly believed it.
That belief shattered the psychological barrier of fear that had paralyzed the population for decades. It emboldened the street.
Hundreds of thousands of people poured out of their homes because they genuinely believed the military was on their side.
The perception of military defection actually willed the reality of regime collapse into existence.
It was essentially a self-fulfilling prophecy weaponized through information warfare.
And bridging that to Iran in 2026, we see exactly how the regime has adapted.
The Iranian security apparatus meticulously studied the lessons of Tunisia 2011, the wider Arab Spring, and their own vulnerability during previous protest waves.
To prevent that kind of viral myth-making momentum from taking hold, the regime didn't just throttle the internet.
They initiated a complete digital annihilation.
The data provided by the internet monitoring group NetBlocks is chilling. Starting in early January 2026, as the bizarre protests escalated, the Iranian regime imposed a near-total nationwide internet blackout.
They didn't just block social media platforms, they severed the country from the global internet, reducing national connectivity down to approximately 1% of normal levels.
The reports also detail internal security forces systematically raiding neighborhoods to confiscate illicit satellite dishes, specifically targeting attempts to access external networks like Starlink.
They plunged a nation of over 85 million people into absolute digital darkness.
And this digital quarantine directly blunts the effectiveness of the foreign intervention.
The cyber warfare annexes in our sources note that the U.S. and Israel haven't just been dropping bombs. They have been executing massive cyber offensive operations.
They are hacking Iranian state news websites, hijacking broadcast signals, and infiltrating domestic messaging apps with psychological operations.
They are broadcasting messages saying it's time for reckoning, directly urging IRGC and besieged forces to lay down their arms and join the civilian population.
They are actively attempting to artificially engineer that Tunisian disinformation magic.
But if the entire domestic population is severed from the network, who is actually receiving these psychological operations?
The audience for those sophisticated cyber ops is effectively zero.
And the sources warn that the foreign intervention carries an even more severe unintended consequence, a strategic vulnerability they define as the reputational trap.
This concept of the reputational trap is fascinating and terrifying.
The briefings indicate that the U.S. and Israel, seeking to maximize internal pressure on the regime and stretch its security forces thin, have reportedly begun arming, funding, and providing intelligence to ethnic proxy militias operating inside Iran's borders.
We are looking at support for Kurdish armed groups in the rugged northwest, organizations like the PDKI and the Kurdistan Freedom Party.
Simultaneously, they are backing Sunni Balochi militant groups in the volatile southeast, such as the newly active People's Fighters Front.
On paper, from a strictly conventional military planning perspective, opening multiple asymmetric fronts against a centralized adversary makes tactical sense. It forces the IRGC to dilute its forces away from the capital.
However, politically and sociologically, it is an incredibly hazardous maneuver.
By heavily backing armed ethnic separatist movements, the external powers inadvertently hand the IRGC a massive, desperately needed propaganda victory.
Because it allows the regime to fundamentally rewrite the narrative of the conflict.
They are no longer on state television explaining why they are beating pro-democracy university students or shooting striking shopkeepers.
The narrative shifts entirely to national survival. They frame themselves as the only entity capable of defending the sacred borders of the Iranian motherland from foreign-backed terrorists intent on balkanizing the state.
The IRGC immediately seizes the mantle of the sole defenders of Iranian territorial integrity. They weaponize the historical Iranian fear of a fractured, divided nation.
This allows them to rally their hardline ideological base.
And, crucially, it can draw in secular Iranian nationalists who may despise the clerical rule but fear the disintegration of Iran even more.
The IRGC can then employ extreme, unrestrained violence against these ethnic groups, such as launching ballistic missiles at Kurdish bases in neighboring Iraq, or flattening Balochi villages under the unassailable guise of national defense.
Meanwhile, they utilize that same martial law environment to quietly and ruthlessly crush the broader economic and political protests in Tehran and Isfahan.
The foreign intervention, by utilizing ethnic proxies, risks degrading a popular unified domestic uprising into a muddy, chaotic geopolitical proxy war. It risks neutralizing the moral clarity that the street protests initially possessed.
That is a profound strategic insight. It demonstrates how aggressive external pressure can paradoxically act as a binding agent, solidifying the very power structures it intends to dismantle by giving them an existential external enemy.
But what if the pressure applied isn't just a sudden kinetic shock, but a long, grinding economic and structural decay?
That leads us directly to our third historical case study, the systemic dissolution of the Soviet Union from 1990 to 1991.
The Soviet model provides a vastly different anatomy of state collapse.
The USSR didn't disintegrate primarily because millions of citizens suddenly marched on the Kremlin in a unified democratic uprising.
It collapsed due to a profound terminal structural rot, decades of compounding economic stagnation, and ultimately a severe fragmentation among the ruling elite.
The analysts in our sources draw very clear lines between the geopolitical pressures faced by the late USSR and Iran in 2026.
Both states suffered from immense, debilitating sanctions fatigue that slowly choked their industrial capacity.
Both experienced a long-term economic degradation, the kind of slow bleed that we saw sparking the initial bizarre protests in Tehran.
Both systems relied heavily on massive, paranoid, heavily resourced, internal security institutions to maintain artificial order.
And both found themselves locked in a state of intense, unwinnable external pressure and arms racing with the West.
The parallels in the macroeconomic stressors are undeniable, but the critical divergence lies in how that pressure translated into elite behavior.
In the Soviet Union, the structural rot eventually led to the splits within the communist leadership becoming highly public and irreconcilable.
The tipping point was the attempted hardliner coup against Mikhail Gorbachev in August 1991.
The old guard tried to seize power using the military and the KGB, but they failed spectacularly. That highly visible public failure laid bare the deep, fatal divisions within the state.
Once the illusion of centralized unified authority evaporated during that coup, the entire Soviet empire unraveled with astonishing speed.
Contrast that with the intelligence coming out of Iran right now. The sources emphasize that while elite splits certainly exist, they are currently imperceptible in open channels.
We know objectively that there must be furious, existential internal debates occurring within the regime right now, especially following the sudden violent death of Khamenei.
But the remaining state apparatus is working overtime to project a facade of absolute unity.
The sources explicitly note that in the immediate aftermath of the epic fury strikes, the surviving regime elements didn't descend into public infighting.
Instead, they rapidly formed an interim leadership council.
This council is designed to absorb and project the supreme leader's authority until the assembly of experts can be safely convened to select a permanent replacement.
Furthermore, they are formally devolving significant administrative and security powers to trusted provincial governors.
They are actively structuring the state to function despite the decapitation in Tehran. They are closing ranks, building redundancies, and prioritizing survival over public factionalism.
And observing this structural resilience brings us to a monumental shift in U.S. foreign policy doctrine that the comparative analysis highlights.
We need to examine what the analysts call the nuclear doctrine shift.
During the collapse of the Soviet Union under the Bush administration, the absolute overriding primary goal of the United States was stabilization.
Washington was absolutely terrified of the loose nukes scenario, the prospect of thousands of nuclear warheads falling into the hands of rogue generals, warlords, or terrorists across a fracturing, chaotic Soviet empire.
The U.S. actively desired a controlled, manageable transition of power to secure that vast nuclear arsenal.
But the policy applied to Iran in 2026 is the exact polar opposite.
The strategic documents state clearly that the U.S. has adopted a doctrine of preventive war.
And the justification for this shift is based on Iran's status. Iran is not viewed as an established, stabilized superpower with a secure arsenal. It is categorized as a threshold state.
According to the declassified briefings in our stack, immediately prior to the February airstrikes, U.S. and Israeli intelligence estimated that Iran was mere weeks, potentially even as few as 10 days, away from achieving a nuclear breakout capability.
That timeline completely rewrites the strategic calculus.
Because the current U.S. administration views a nuclear-armed Islamic Republic not just as a regional problem, but as an unacceptable existential threat to global stability, their primary objective shifted entirely away from stabilization.
The goal became active, aggressive dismantling.
The U.S. strategy, as violently executed through Operation Epic Fury, accepts the goal of regime decapitation and the total physical obliteration of the nuclear and ballistic missile infrastructure.
The implications of that are staggering. The U.S. is essentially broadcasting that they are willing to accept the absolute unpredictable chaos of a collapsed, heavily armed state in the center of the Middle East if that is the price required to guarantee the destruction of the nuclear program.
It's a geopolitical wager of immense proportions. The U.S. is willingly trading the fear of vast regional instability and potential state failure for the immediate elimination of a nuclear threshold threat.
It is a profound and highly risky paradigm shift. And analyzing the potential fallout of that gamble brings us to our fourth and final historical comparison.
This one is perhaps the most resonant and complex because it requires looking at Iran's own internal history.
The 1979 revolution that ousted Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran.
When you look at the socioeconomic drivers of 1979 versus the crisis of 2026, the similarities jump off the page.
In both eras, the ruling Iranian state faced a deep existential crisis of legitimacy among the working and middle classes.
In both eras, severe compounding economic strain pushed the general population beyond the brink of tolerance.
And crucially, in both eras, you saw the paralyzing power of mass national strikes.
Just as the coordinated strikes by oil workers and the traditional bazaris effectively severed the economic arteries of the Shah's government in '79, the late 2025 protests were driven heavily by sustained national strikes from major merchant guilds and critical labor sectors.
The underlying social thermodynamics are remarkably consistent. A population squeezed by inflation, corruption, and a lack of political representation eventually boils over.
However, the architecture of the opposition movement channeling that anger is fundamentally different.
In 1979, the revolutionary movement was a vast umbrella encompassing diverse communist, leftist, and democratic factions.
But it ultimately coalesced around a highly organized, deeply rooted, and symbolically powerful leadership structure headed by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini.
Despite being in exile, Khomeini provided a unifying ideological vision, a clear, recognizable alternative to the monarchy, and a network of mosques to distribute his directives.
Contrast that highly structured network with the reality of today. The intelligence assessments describe the 2025-2026 protests as highly fragmented and characterize the social mobilization as episodic and transactional.
Yes, you have millions of citizens who are furiously angry, and yes, there are prevalent chants demanding the return of the Pahlavi dynasty, but there is no unified, universally accepted leadership physically located inside the country directing the masses.
It is decentralized, leaderless anger organized spontaneously over encrypted apps before the internet was severed.
And the absence of that unified internal leadership leads us to a fascinating, almost forgotten historical nugget found deep in the policy sources regarding U.S. strategy.
It refers to something we can term the inverse option C.
Let's dig into option C, because this is wild history.
Back in late 1978 and early 1979, as the Carter administration watched the Shia's government crumbling under the weight of the revolution, a fierce debate broke out in Washington.
A specific faction within the administration, primarily led by National Security Advisors Zbigniew Brzezinski, proposed a radical contingency plan dubbed Option C.
This plan argued that if the Shah fell, the U.S. should actively back a hardline junta comprised of the Iranian military's top brass.
The U.S. would encourage them to step in, declare absolute martial law, and brutally crush the civilian revolution in order to maintain a pro-Western, anti-Soviet anchor in the Persian Gulf.
It was the ultimate realpolitik proposal.
The Carter administration ultimately balked and never pulled the trigger on Option C, torn by internal conflicts over human rights commitments versus raw strategic realities.
But what is incredibly revealing is how the policy analysts in our sources view Operation Epic Fury in 2026 directly through the lens of that abandoned 1979 plan.
Exactly. The sources suggest that Epic Fury functions as an inverse Option C.
In 1979, the U.S. actively considered utilizing the threat of massive internal military force to support and preserve the structure of the existing regime.
Today, the Trump administration has applied massive, overwhelming external kinetic force directly against the regime's military structure.
The underlying strategic logic of Epic Fury relies on a very specific assumption. The assumption is that by physically destroying the regime's heavy military assets, vaporizing its commanding control, and decapitating its highest leadership, the U.S. will shatter the internal security apparatus.
The hope is that under this unbearable external strain, the IRGC will collapse, thereby relieving the pressure on the Iranian street and allowing a democratic revolution to succeed.
But as the historical analysis points out, applying massive external military pressure on a heavily armed, deeply ideological military institution like the IRGC often produces the exact opposite of the intended effect.
It doesn't fracture them.
It unifies them further. It gives them no option but to circle the wagons and fight to the death.
Which brings us to the ultimate, unavoidable question for you, the listener. Let's play out the absolute best-case scenario for the architects of Epic Fury.
Let's say the strikes work perfectly.
Let's say the street protests surge, despite the internet blackout. The IRGC fundamentally buckles under the pressure, and the Islamic Republic finally falls after nearly 50 years.
What exactly replaces it? As the old saying goes, nature abhors a vacuum, and geopolitics abhors it even more violently.
Our sources introduce us to the most prominent detailed transitional plan currently circulating in policy circles.
Exiled Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi's Iran Prosperity Project, and specifically its critical emergency phase.
It is essential to look at this because it moves the conversation from the abstract destruction of a state to the terrifying reality of trying to build a new one the day after.
Pahlavi, alongside allied legal and political experts at the National Union for Democracy in Iran, has mapped out a highly structured, phased blueprint intended to take over administration immediately upon the collapse of the clerical regime.
The transitional plan relies on the rapid establishment of three proposed pillars of governance. First, the creation of the Behestan,
which is designed to serve as a temporary legislative body or a transitional parliament to provide representational legitimacy.
Second, the establishment of the Divan, functioning as a transitional judiciary.
This is crucial to prevent mob justice and maintain some semblance of legal continuity and order in a chaotic post-collapse environment.
And third, the formation of a transitional executive government whose sole mandate is to actually run the day-to-day administration of the country.
Managing food distribution, stabilizing the currency, and literally keeping the lights and water on.
And what is particularly notable about this architecture is its deliberate ambiguity regarding the ultimate permanent form of the Iranian state.
Pahlavi, positioning himself under the title of leader of the national uprising, intends to utilize this transitional state structure merely to stabilize the nation for a strictly defined period of 4 months.
Right. It's a cooling-off period. After that 4-month stabilization phase, the Prosperity Project mandates a nationwide, internationally monitored public referendum.
The Iranian people would vote directly on the future of their nation, choosing between establishing a new democratic secular republic or a return to a parliamentary constitutional monarchy.
The entire mechanism is explicitly designed to prevent the kind of rapid, ideological power grab that Khomeini successfully executed in 1979.
From a purely theoretical standpoint, it is a highly rational, democratic roadmap. But the Prosperity Project also includes a specific mandate regarding the security sector that is incredibly fraught and perhaps dangerously optimistic.
It calls for the complete mandatory dissolution of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps.
Let's dig deeply into that requirement. Pahlavi's plan demands the absolute dismantling of the IRGC in its entirety.
It also calls for abolishing the morality police, disbanding the Basij paramilitary forces, and shuttering the revolutionary courts.
The proposed strategy is to vet the disbanded forces, integrate regular non-ideological soldiers back into a newly unified national military, and aggressively pursue transitional justice and tribunals against high-ranking human rights abusers.
On paper, sitting in a think tank in Washington or a conference room in Paris, it sounds like the necessary hygienic cleansing of a totalitarian system.
But here is where we must forcefully apply the cold reality check derived from our first historical lens, Romania.
In 1989, the Romanian people, completely traumatized by decades of surveillance, wanted the Securitate entirely eradicated.
But the Securitate, as an institution comprised of tens of thousands of trained operatives and officers, was not magically erased from the earth just because Nicolae Ceausescu was dead.
This is the terrifying historical parallel. The sources detail exactly what happened in the vacuum of post-Ceausescu Romania.
The second-tier elites, the mid-level intelligence officers, and the surviving military commanders of the old communist regime didn't just go home.
They rapidly rebranded themselves.
They formed a new political entity called the National Salvation Front, led by a former communist insider named Ion Iliescu.
They quickly stepped into the power vacuum, adopted pro-democratic rhetoric to appease the West in the streets, and essentially captured the revolution from the inside out.
Political scientists refer to what happened in Romania as a pseudo-transition. The National Salvation Front manipulated the chaotic privatization of state-owned assets.
The very intelligence officers who used to oppress the public used their insider knowledge and connections to buy up state industries for pennies on the dollar.
Rapidly mutating into incredibly wealthy, entrenched oligarchs.
They maintained absolute, albeit covert, control of the economy and the deep state security apparatus, creating a pervasive kleptocracy that crippled true democratic reform and economic development in Romania for well over a decade.
So if we take that historical model and extrapolate it to the reality of Iran in 2026, the implications are chilling.
Imagine a scenario where a transitional government, perhaps backed by the West, declares the IRGC completely dismantled on a piece of paper.
But on the ground, inside Iran, the IRGC still physically holds all the assault rifles.
They still control the regional ballistic missile silos.
They still operate the vast telecommunications network.
And they still control the illicit smuggling routes that bring in hard currency. What actually happens?
The intelligence assessments in our stack are quite grim and highly realistic on this specific point.
They conclude that the most probable immediate outcome of the current crisis, following the decapitation strikes, is not a swift, peaceful democratic transition guided by exiled leaders flying back into Tehran.
Rather, there is a severe, highly elevated risk of the surviving elements of the IRGC hardening into a brutal, unapologetic military junta.
A junta. They lose the clerical facade. They lose the supreme leader.
The religious ideology takes the backseat, but they retain the absolute monopoly on violence and capital.
The sources describe them potentially establishing what they call a primitive war economy.
They would leverage their highly resilient distributed command structure and their vast, untaxed economic holdings to survive.
They would use the perpetual cover of fighting an existential foreign war against the United States and Israel to justify total, absolute martial control over the domestic population.
They would simply fill the immense power vacuum left by the decapitated religious leadership with raw, unfiltered military dictatorship.
We have covered an immense, heavy amount of ground today. Let's synthesize this complex picture for you.
Iran, as we look at it in March 2026, is a completely unique, highly combustible hybrid of historical models.
It possesses the intense grassroots social unrest and burning economic frustration that we saw ignite Tunisia in 2011, mirroring the societal pressures that drove its own revolution in 1979.
It exhibits the deep, structural, sanction-induced institutional rot and economic stagnation that eventually doomed the Soviet Union in 1991.
But crucially, the variable that alters all this historical math is its internal security apparatus.
The IRGC is far too ideologically entrenched, far too financially independent, and far too structurally decentralized to simply fold its tents and vanish overnight the way the Romanian conscript army did in 1989.
Especially when they are under direct, overwhelming attack by foreign military forces.
Right.
And this brings us back to why this specific geopolitical moment matters directly to you, the listener, and to the broader stability of the globe. The success of this unprecedented foreign intervention, the massive gamble of Operation Epic Fury in actually achieving sustainable regime change, isn't just a matter of dropping enough precision-guided munitions on command bunkers.
As one of the lead strategic analysts in our sources brilliantly frames it, the current conflict is essentially a high-stakes race between degradation and distraction.
That framing is exactly right. The core strategic question defining the next few months is this: can the United States and Israel physically degrade Iran's military capacity, its nuclear infrastructure, and its internal command structure faster than Iran can distract the U.S. and its allies?
Can the IRGC bleed Western resources, disrupt vital global shipping lanes in the Strait of Hormuz, and cause enough international political fatigue to force a halt to the strikes?
Because if this conflict drags on into a protracted stalemate, the historical model suggests the attrition heavily favors the deeply entrenched, domestically situated defender, the IRGC.
Which leaves us with a final, entirely new provocative thought to chew on as you watch the news cycle this week.
We have spent this entire deep dive looking strictly inward at Iran's internal structure and domestic forces. We know Operation Epic Fury may have successfully decapitated the Iranian regime in Tehran. Khamenei is gone. The top generals are dead.
The command and control is in chaos. But if the IRGC transitions into an inward-looking, hyper-militarized junta, struggling simply to maintain control of its own cities, or worse, if the Iranian state fractures completely, what happens to the vast axis of resistance outside of Iran's borders?
That is the multi-billion-dollar question that the airstrikes haven't answered. If the head of the octopus in Tehran is suddenly cut off, what happens to the heavily armed tentacles?
Exactly. What happens to Hezbollah in Lebanon, possessing tens of thousands of rockets?
What happens to the Houthi movement in Yemen, who control vital shipping lanes?
What happens to the powerful Shia proxy militias in Iraq and Syria?
For decades, these groups have relied on the IRGC for funding, sophisticated weaponry, and strategic direction. If the IRGC collapses internally or is forced to abandon its foreign operations to fight a civil war at home, do these massive proxy armies simply wither away and disarm?
Or, freed from the restraining hand of Tehran, do they become independent, heavily armed, entirely uncontrollable rogue actors lashing out across the Middle East?
It's a terrifying prospect that could redefine global security for a generation. It is the defining question of this crisis, and the answer will reshape the globe. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the headlines, keep looking for the historical rhymes, and we'll be here to unpack the next stack of sources with you. Stay informed.